So we're working our way through our immune system, and we have the innate immunity, which is part of our construction or design, and we have the adaptive immunity, which is something that we have to acquire. So it takes time. It's not there immediately to take care of you. It will be there if you have the proper genetics for recognition of the offending pathogen. So we're going to go over the various innate or built-in mechanisms as we go through our notes, and then we'll go into the adaptive or acquired immunity after that. So let's take a look at the innate defenses. So this means disease resistance is automatic, it's built in, it's part of your construction. When we take a look at you, it's your actual construction which is protecting you for the most part. A pathogen, a disease-causing microorganism. That can be a virus, that can be a bacteria, that can be a parasite, and anything that can cause you actual harm. Surface barriers, that's our innate branch that we're actually talking about here. Body's first line of defense. So this is skin, absolutely, or mucosal surfaces, right? Because we also have mucosal surfaces exposed, and that's two of our surface defenses that if they're breached, then we have to take a look at other ways to actually protect us. But the skin and our mucous membranes are excellent physical barriers. Many layers of cells here, that's referring to the skin, correct? Because mucosa doesn't have many layers except only in our oral cavity, because our oral cavity is actually a mucosal area. It's still a stratified squamous cells, but it's non-keratinized and not necessarily as thick in its layering as our skin is. So our skin is a mantle. We have all these dead surface cells, so it's easy for them to slough, and anything that tries to latch on gets knocked off as the skin cells get knocked off. Chemical barriers. Okay, so we have some things here listed. We have acid. This happens every single time. Doesn't like me. We have acid, we have enzymes, we have mucin, and this protein called defensin. So let's take a look at acid first. Acid is very effective at preventing the growth of many different types of microorganisms. Our skin is actually that acid mantle because we have sweat that is acidic and we have sebaceous secretions which are also acidic. So those two things together create a lower pH, which inhibits growth for many different organisms. The stomach, well, yeah, ingests things and comes on in. The stomach is a wonderful place. It has a native or natural pH of 2. So the stomach's pH of 2 is excellent. You're pouring acid on the pathogen that's entering in through this system. And in addition to acid bath that you're giving them, you also have various enzymes in the stomach, protein digesting enzymes that are actually going to dismantle also all kinds of microorganisms that can come in that way. Yes?
When we have a reaction to something that's like really poisonous and it makes us throw up, is that coming from the stomach because it's hitting the stomach? Are those enzymes in there that are causing that? Or, like if you ingest something that's really, you're automatically going to start vomiting.
So the question is, if you ingest a toxin, is it the chemicals in your stomach and the interaction between the chemicals in your stomach and the toxin that causes you to actually vomit? And no, it is actually not that. It's materials in the toxin actually cause the stomach to actually react, the smooth muscle of the stomach to actually react and create a reverse peristalsis for you. So, yeah. Good question. Enzymes. So in addition to stomach enzymes, these are different enzymes, and these are enzymes associated with mucosal surfaces because most mucosal surfaces are a simple epithelial layer and the CT that keeps it attached. And so it's nice to know that old lysozyme is in our saliva, so it's a digestive enzyme, and also in our lacrimal secretions. And so when we have our tears, part of the lacrimal fluid is actually lysozyme, which is a digestive enzyme. There you go. Let's pull that off. Mucin. Mucin is really sticky, thick, viscous mucus, and it is going to be more common in our respiratory airways, helps to trap bacteria, doesn't allow them to actually wiggle around and get out. We also have some mucin also in our eye secretions. Defensins. Defensins are an interesting group of proteins because they act like broad spectrum antimicrobials. So an antimicrobial is our antibiotic, and broad spectrum means it's a shotgun effect type of an antibiotic and designed to, take out as many different types of organisms as possible. So defensins are secreted by the mucosa, and it's typically small amounts, just enough to take care of any accidental pathogen that's actually landing there. But if you do have inflammation present, you will have an increase in amount of defensins secreted. So that's the surface barrier. That's our first line of defense. Now, let's take a look again at some other methods the innate system has built in that keeps us protected from the bad stuff out in our world. And now we're down to some cells, which are non-specific. They'll attack any kind of stuff that they come across, and some various chemicals that are produced by our system that are designed to also be broad in their approach to what types of pathogens they're trying to protect us from. So the number one cellular component is our phagocytes, found just under the skin and mucous membranes. More or less they are in the CT. So they're hanging around in the CT. So dermis and subdermis for any pathogens. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a sliver. So any pathogen that breaches the surface. They engulf the particle, it fuses with the lysosome, and you get a phagolysosome. Whenever they engulf the particle, it's brought in a vesicle. So that's a little membrane-bound space that's around, for example, a bacterium. And all of our phagocytes basically do this, make that phagolysosome. And now we have digestive enzymes pouring on the bad thing that they've taken in, and it dismantles it. It breaks it down into itty bits and pieces that it can get rid of by exocytosis if necessary, or take it to various areas such as the liver for further removal from the system. This is showing us the number one phagocyte that we have, that we know about, is the macrophage, the various process of the ingestion of the infectious agent and the phagolysosome and removal. But I want you to realize also neutrophils are phagocytes. So we have our macrophage and this guy called the dendritic cell. So this dendritic cell, he's special because this dendritic cell is a macrophage that is designed to interact with the actual immune system, our adaptive branch. And so they will take in the pathogen, they will break it up, as we talked about with the phagolysosome process, but then they will actually wear it on their surface so that they can show it to the branch of our immune system that will help us actually mount an immune response. So they're very important in that process. So we'll fill in some notes here on macrophages, body's main phagocyte, wandering through almost all body tissues. And I'll say soft. You don't find them wandering through bone or cartilage and things along that line, though they will be in the perimeter. Okay. They used to be monocytes when they were in the bloodstream. And through the process of diapedesis, they left the bloodstream to get into the soft tissues. And again, these guys are important because they live to fight another day. So after they engulf the pathogen and digest it and everything and get rid of it, they go on and do it again. Unlike our neutrophils, neutrophils also are white blood cells waiting around for pathogens. They do the phagolysosome process. However, they are typically the first to arrive. So typically the first WBC to arrive in the area where we're actually getting infestation or penetration of our pathogen. These guys are interesting because they produce defensins also. And defensins to me are like knives. You can use a knife on just about any sort of pathogen. So they have their little defensins knives and they're going around poking holes in the pathogen, and that's how defensins actually work. Even the defensins that we mentioned up above that are actually part of mucosal surfaces secretions. They go around literally stabbing holes in the pathogen, and then the pathogen will explode because water leaks in and they explode out. The thing about neutrophils, they don't survive the battle, so killed in the process. So if, example, you have a sliver in your skin that got down to the soft tissues, the neutrophils will be coming in there trying to help eradicate it and break it down and to destroy it, but they won't be able to because it's actually too hard for them to do that. But they'll be working on the things attached to the surface, which are typically pathogens, bugs, that type of stuff, and they will go ahead and accumulate in the area, and they'll die, and which works really well because it helps to make it easier for the sliver to actually be extruded for you. And those little pus things are dead neutrophils. So the pus that you see associated with most infections are neutrophils. Dendritic cells, those phagocytes that interact with the immune system, very important to do that, but they are actually still phagocytes, so they're part of the innate system. They get rid of the pathogen when they encounter it. They do live to fight another day. Basophils and mast cells, these are two very different cells. Basophils are in the blood, mast cells are always in the soft tissues. Mast cells are never in the bloodstream. Mast cells are always in the soft tissues. Basophils, however, can go from the bloodstream just like all other WBCs because of diapedesis and go into the soft tissues. And they look so incredibly similar. They both secrete pro-inflammatory chemicals. And what you have to realize that these guys, these pro-inflammatory chemicals that they're actually secreting are histamine and heparin. So histamine and heparin are in the granules. So those big blue granules that you actually see in basophils, mast cells, are heparin. They are designed, histamine and heparin is designed to increase fluid movement into the area. So wherever our pathogen is, we're trying to actually bring in fluid because that's actually part of the inflammatory process of actually walling it off. They also secrete chemicals that will attract immune cells to the area. Our immune cells, I want you to always remember, those are lymphocytes. That's why we talked about the lymphatic system and the various lymphatic organs. Those lymphocytes are indeed the main cells of the immune system. I love natural killer cells. They are really aggressive. They're like Navy SEALs that have come back from deployment, and they're all hyped up on testosterone, and you look at them funny. You speak to them, and they're standing in the middle of the road on their cell phone texting, and somebody in their car honks their horn at them, and they look like they're going to kill the guy in the car, even though they're in the wrong. That's what natural killer cells are like. They are born to kill, and they're ready and willing, and you don't need to tell them to do that. All you have to do is look cross-eyed at them, and they're ready to actually attack you for that. And that's great because they kill cancer. They kill various viruses and bacteria. Viruses are inside our cells, bacteria are not inside our cells, and the bad part is they also kill transplant cells because they don't belong there. You don't belong here, and I'm going to take you out. You look at me cross-eyed, I'm going to take you out. That's what they do. So you cannot have, you have to have a certain amount of natural killer cells because they're looking for a fight. And if everything's fine and you have a whole bunch of them looking for a fight, they're going to start working on you. So there's always a limited amount of natural killer cells in your system because that's all your system can stand. You know, it cannot stand a bunch of rambunctious military guys all hyped up on testosterone. You know, it's just the way it is. So, but they're really very efficient. The other thing about these guys, which are just like a lot of the military, they are direct cell-to-cell contact. And what these guys do is they'll land on the infected cell and they actually do a little bit of what I call a time bomb. They secrete, so once they attach, they secrete a chemical called perforin. Can you figure out what perforin does? Perforin perforates, right? So they secrete perforin. So it actually drills a little hole into the offending agent or the pathogen, and then insert granzymes. Granzymes are going to cause cellular apoptosis. Remember, it's apoptosis. Apoptosis. Apoptosis is premature cell death. It basically makes the cell commit suicide. Very effective in preventing spread. So it kills the cell that it comes into contact with. And that's what's happening with you right now. All the time, you have absolutely no idea. All the time you have cells in your body currently undergoing malignant transformation. Well, that means they're turning into cancer. And these natural killer cells are doing their job for you, and you do not develop cancer because they recognize you don't belong here. I'm going to take you out. That cell's gone, and it cannot actually cause any further spread of cancer. So that's what's keeping everybody right now from acquiring cancer at this moment. Your immune system is why you're here.
So when you do get cancer, they stop recognizing, they don't recognize the correct mutation, or?
Well, when you do get cancer, the natural killer cells obviously failed you in that process. The other thing, too, is some cancer cells are really, really rapid. And remember, I said you have a finite amount of natural killer cells. And so those cancer cells, cancers that get to a large enough size, natural killer cells can't help you out at that process. But they, however, may help with actually preventing some of the spread in the early stages. But lots of malignancies, cancer malignancies, have a lovely tendency to actually spread throughout your system, depending upon where the cancer starts. But that's for another class. Eosinophils, they love worms. They target parasites. And so that's why they have those lovely red granules. So these red granules are lethal to parasites. And they literally dump their granules onto the parasite. They degranulate onto the parasite. Yeah. Now you have to understand, if they're degranulating onto the parasite, enzymes are going into the environment in which the parasite is, and so there's going to be a definite inflammatory process to that. The other interesting thing is, whenever you have something as a parasitic infection, your eosinophil counts go up. And also whenever you have allergies and asthma, eosinophil counts go up. Not as high as if you had a parasitic infection, but it is also the case. Asthma and allergies, for some reason, increases EOs for a lot of people on poorly controlled asthma and allergies. Let's see here. Inflammation. So inflammation is a nonspecific response to invasion by an offending organism or pathogen. And that's why it says tissue response to injury. The bad stuff gets in you and it starts to actually damage you. And so inflammatory process is designed to do actually several things. It's designed to prevent spread. To nearby areas. In other words, it's trying to keep things localized. It will help to set the stage for actual repair. And it will help dispose of debris and pathogens. Whenever inflammation is present, there's typically 4 things that you will actually feel or experience with that. Redness, heat, swelling, and pain. Those are the typical signs. The reason we have redness and heat is due to increased blood flow to the area. Whenever you vasodilate, blood will flow in the area, and blood is nice and red, and so the area will turn red. Also, blood is nice and warm, and the area will turn hot. And what will also happen is we will have swelling because we have, with inflammation, we have increased vascular permeability, which means we're making the vessels that have dilated up and bringing more blood to the area more leaky. Not to the cells, but to the fluid. So increased vascular permeability. When we have inflammation present, you can experience pain, and that might be due to chemicals that are being released by the pathogens in the area, or even the cells fighting the pathogen in the area as part of the inflammatory process. So we can have here microbial toxins as that chemical causing pain, or even your cells that are present releasing chemicals causing pain. Do you remember what we call pain receptors? Nociceptors. So we'll have activation of nociceptors. And then also swelling. Swelling can also cause pain, just like too much light in your eyes, too much bright light. And so swelling can cause pain. So we have nociceptor activation and even mechanoreceptor activation. Inflammation is a stepwise process. We first will actually have inflammatory chemicals being released, and the reason that they're released is that the injured tissues are releasing these chemicals. So the injured tissues are releasing histamine, which we mentioned earlier. That's part of mast cells and basophils. Histamine is a very potent vasodilator. The injured tissue will also release prostaglandins and kinins. And those both promote vasodilation, just as histamine does, but they also activate nociceptors and therefore produce pain. So prostaglandins and kinins also will cause pain for you in those areas. Vasodilation will occur because of the chemicals, And we will have increased capillary permeability because of those chemicals. So injured tissues, A, release chemicals. Chemicals B cause vasodilation and increased vascular permeability. That's why it's listed there as a second step. And when you have increased blood flow and leaky capillaries, you get a condition called hyperemia. The area is congested with blood, so it's filled with blood, not in the soft tissues, but in the blood, still in the vascular tree, and then the plasma is leaking out also into the tissue areas. So we call the fluid leaking out of, what blood vessel will the fluid leak out of? Capillaries. That's part of our capillary dynamic. We call that an exudate. Initially, it's going to be clear, but as more fighting goes on, more cellular debris goes in, it will become cloudy, and even if we actually have destruction of some of the blood vessels or capillaries in the area, we can actually have it even bloody. If we want to fight hyperemia, if we want to fight vasodilation, we want to actually use things that will fight these guys up here. So to fight this process, or to counteract this, we would like to take what for histamine? An antihistamine. So antihistamines will be very helpful because they help to decrease the vasodilation. And then we want to take another chemical to help fight off these chemicals that are causing us problems with increased permeability or vasodilation, and pain. And these are very common. Antihistamines are common over the counter, correct? Yes. The other one to fight prostaglandins and kinins are also very common and over the counter.
Anti-inflammatory.
Anti-inflammatories, that's right. NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. The one drug that they all are trying to live up to in their ability to decrease inflammation and pain is aspirin. So aspirin, ASA is our medical abbreviation for aspirin. Aspirin is the king of our anti-inflammatories. There's a problem, however, with aspirin. Do you guys remember what the problem with aspirin is? Yeah, platelets, an antiplatelet. So the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are like aspirin, except they're not antiplatelet. So that's one of the advantages of those. Both of them still can cause quite a bit of stomach problems. So aspirin, it's an anti-prostaglandin. Will decrease inflammation and pain. And also that vasodilation. So now we have cells releasing chemicals, chemicals causing increasing blood flow and vascular permeability. We're getting leakage of fluid or exudate into the soft tissues, and then we see another process. We have all this fluid, and now we need some cells to actually work on combating that which is causing the damage. And that will be our third step here in this process called phagocyte mobilization. And we will have this process called leukocytosis. You guys know what leukocytes are. Those are white blood cells. Leukocytosis means we are going to bring or create more leukocytes. So leukocytosis is due to chemicals released by injured cells to cause an increase in WBCs, more specifically neutrophils. So with the inflammation, it is not unusual to see your neutrophil counts go up and up and up. And it depends upon how bad the infection and therefore the inflammation as to how bad it is. Pneumonia, for example, would it have a normal white blood cell count? It would not. If you have a normal immune system and normal bone marrow, you will actually have neutrophil counts go way up with pneumonia. Same thing with meningitis. Those are all those chemicals that are being released to increase our neutrophils, our active fighters for that infectious process. Margination, we talked about that previously when we talked about the white blood, talked about the blood chapter. Cells line up along the inside edge of a capillary because of actually chemotactic factors. But then they squeeze through the capillary walls, that's diapedesis, and they wander out into the interstitial areas where all this fluid is, which makes it easier for them to move around in all that fluid. And they follow what brought them there in the beginning. They follow that chemical scent, that chemotaxis. So cells are releasing all kinds of things that are kind of like help, save me kind of signals. And they wander through the soft tissues with an amoeboid movement. And the soft tissues are in the connective tissue. So we have plasma leaking into the interstitial spaces, causing that swelling. And in that plasma are proteins. We talked about this in our blood chapter, some very important plasma proteins. You guys remember what the #1 plasma protein in your blood is? Albumin. But what other plasma proteins did we talk about in that chapter on blood? We talked about clotting factors or clotting proteins. So all those things that are part of clotting are proteins, and they're circulating around in your bloodstream in what? An active or inactive form? Inactive form. So you have to realize these clotting factors are circulating around in your bloodstream, and they're part of your bloodstream always. So just like blood is part of your bloodstream always, so are clotting factors, so is albumin. All those proteins that are part of the numbers that we gave you for the blood chapter are always there. So now clotting factors are leaking out into the interstitial spaces, and they're getting activated. And that's an important thing because we want to limit the spread of the pathogen. So that's an important aspect of that. Besides our clotting proteins, I often call them clotting factors because it's factor 10, factor 2, factor 5. You guys remember all that in calcium, and platelet factor 3. All those are very important in the initiation of our clotting cascade. So we have clotting proteins that are part of the plasma proteins that I'm talking about. We also have some complement proteins that we're going to talk about soon that are also designed to actually fight the pathogen in that area. We'll talk in just a minute about the details of that. And also there are antibodies always floating around in your bloodstream that are being produced by a very, very specific type of cell called a B cell that has been activated and turned into a plasma cell. So these guys are all designed to limit the spread of the pathogen so that they can eradicate it and you can recover. There are some important antimicrobial proteins besides the ones that I've mentioned right here, and one of them is interferon. Interferon is designed to fight viruses. In complement, those are actually more of antibacterial or bacterial type of proteins that are going to help us. So with our interferons, what happens here is an infected cell, so it's infected with a virus, produces interferons, and that's typically abbreviated IFN. They produce interferon and release it into the interstitial spaces around it. It's in the interstitial spaces, and the surrounding cells in the interstitial spaces will actually take up this interferon. And then are able to prevent the virus, which is going to try to attack it, from actually replicating. Because that's what a virus does. A virus goes into a cell, takes over the cell's machinery to replicate itself. Well, interferon is produced by the cell that's going to die. It got infected with the virus. It cannot survive and protect itself, but it can help its neighbors. And so it produces the interferon, lets its friends know that this is going on. They take up the interferon, and then the virus cannot replicate inside the adjacent cells that actually take up the interferon. So infected cell dies, the initial but surrounding cells live. This is virus specific, but it's any virus. So it's designed to protect us from viruses. This just shows a little bit about the interferon process. Here's the infected cell making the interferon, and it's being taken up by the normal cell, which no longer will allow the virus to actually invade it and replicate. So the virus no longer is successful in its process. It also shows that interferon can help pump up natural killer cells. And natural killer cells don't need much help, but they can definitely pump them up and make them even more effective in their job, as well as making macrophages a little bit more happy about their job too. Complement. Again, this is those proteins that are now surrounding, creating what I call your own protein moat around the pathogen itself. So over 30 plasma proteins circulating in the bloodstream in an inactive state until they get activated. And so they need a specific environment for their activation, just like clotting factors needed specific things to activate them. This complement is, I've changed the notes up a little bit. It flows a little bit better for me, so it's going to be a different organization for you guys with this. But it is our major foreign cellular, because a virus is not a cell, cellular control mechanism. So it's antimicrobial, which is bacterial, as far as most people recognize and think, plus bad tissue. So that's a little bit of a cancerous tissue, also our transplant tissue, unfortunately for that. Things that it does not recognize as being actually genetically part of your process. So what happens is these guys are produced in the liver, just like our clotting factors. And they have a significant inflammatory process or feature. So they actually are also part of inflammation. We're going to talk about the three ways that they, when they're activated, what they do. The first thing that we'll talk about is opsonization. And it shows here complement as the C guy. Is attaching to the pathogen, so our bacteria with its little bubbles on it. Those are little polysaccharides, little sugar bubbles on it. And complement attaches to that pathogen, and the macrophage is super happy to see this arrangement and wants to eat it. So the macrophage, already wants to engulf, but now it's just like, oh, I'm super happy to go ahead and do my job even faster. That is when complement attaches that and causes the macrophage to engulf complement and the pathogen. Complement is acting as an opsonizing agent. So opsonin makes it more attractive to macrophage. Complement, when it's activated, can increase inflammation by bringing in mast cells, basophils, neutrophils, and macrophages. chemotactically. So it is making a chemotactic trail for mast cells, basophils, neutrophils, and macrophages. Complement also does this cytolysis. That means cut the cells up, destroy the cells, make them explode. And what happens is complement, when specific complements, you have to understand there's 30 different complement proteins out there, and we're activating various different complement proteins, not all of them at the same time. So with cytolysis, complement will actually form a MAC complex, and I'll discuss that in just a moment. When the MAC attaches to the cell, it bores a hole in the cell, a big hole in the cell, and water rushes in and bursts the cell. And that's a MAC lysis process. Let's add some notes to our opsonization here. Makes the bacteria more attractive to phagocytes, more specifically macrophages. When it does this, complement is called an opsin. In our notes also, the picture also calls it opsonin. Increases inflammation and chemically attracts mast cells, basophils, neutrophils, and macrophages. So a chemotactic type of process when it's activated, certain complements activated. And then cytolysis, the donut-shaped complex called MAC, which means it stands for membrane, attack, complex. So various complement proteins will be activated, they'll polymerize, they'll join together, and they'll literally bore a hole into the membrane of the cell. Flood cell with water to where it literally bursts. MAC is activated by two different mechanisms. So cytolysis and MAC is two ways we can actually turn on the complement proteins involved in formation of MAC. One is called the classical pathway, and the other is called the alternate pathway. In the classical, the reason they have these two different pathways for complement, it truly is two different ways of turning on complement to form MAC. And the classical pathway was discovered first. And with this pathway, it requires antibody to work. Antibody will now be abbreviated AB for antibody. Antibody is from the adaptive immune system. So complement complements the adaptive and the innate system. So we have an adaptive response here. So our bacterium, I'm going to make them look like a blob, long blob here. What happens is that antibody is typically Y-shaped. An antibody will tag or attach to the bacteria, and this attachment is like tagging it or making it more obvious for MAC to actually attach. And so MAC, the complement proteins, are floating around, and when they encounter this antibody-tagged bacterium, they will polymerize and form this circle, and they literally will bore a hole through this cell. This is actually really important in actually transfusion reactions. The alternate pathway is where actually we don't have antibody here tagging or making the bacterium more evident. The bacterium has basically surface polysaccharides, which are little sugars on their surface, which are actually enough to cause complement to actually activate. This one's not as fast as our classical pathway. What's pyro mean? Fire. So pyrogen is a substance which causes fever. Our notes here, chemical which resets the hypothalamus to a higher temperature, and that's how it does that. It actually affects the hypothalamus, will cause it to elevate the temperature that is considered appropriate or reasonable at that time. And this is an important process because various bacteria as well as viruses can release chemicals which will, unfortunately for them, cause a pyrogen aspect. So various bacterial toxins can act as a pyrogen. But also chemicals released by our WBCs and macrophages. There's a reason that we want an elevated body temperature. High body temperature causes sequestration of iron and zinc in the spleen. Sequestration means we're going to grab it and we're going to bind it and we're not going to let it out, so there'll be less out in the system. Fe is for iron and Zn is for zinc. Bacteria need these guys, these two elements, for their own replication or to divide. So the fever is trying to take these items needed for bacterial replication out of the pool so bacteria are less likely to replicate. And so that's a very nice component of pyrogens in that aspect. So it's interesting that bacterial toxins also are acting as pyrogens. You would think that would be anti-survival, but it doesn't matter if the bacteria survives if the bacteria's host doesn't survive. So there's that fine line, I guess, that we have to walk even as a bacteria in order to actually have our own survival occur. Benefits. Well, on replication of bacteria, Pyrogen will decrease bacteria replication, and also on viruses, it will increase cellular activity so that we can actually have more interferons actually being produced and cellular metabolism is up. And also, it acts on our adaptive immunity by actually increasing the activity of our lymphocytes by increasing temperature, because metabolic rates always go up whenever we increase temperature. And we also have an increased temperature will help with increased tissue repair. So those are all of the benefits of an increased temperature for us. That's just the innate system taking care of you. Now we're going to the adaptive system, which people call the immune system, or actually immunity. So what was our first line of defense from invasion? Skin, surface barriers, and anything associated with that. And then the second line was cells and chemicals. And now the third and last line of defense is the immune system, or our lymphocytes, that we're going to take a look at in more detail. The immune system is adaptive because it needs to recognize a foreign substance as being foreign. So it's very particular to the foreign material. Everything else that we discussed, all viruses in this category, all bacteria in this category, parasites in this category, that was the only categorization. This is going to recognize discrete foreign bacteria, discrete foreign viruses, for example. When we activate the immune system, we will activate it because it will respond to that foreign material, which is known as an antigen. So when it says antigen specific, it's a very particular substance. When you get the flu shot this year, and the flu comes around next year, and it's a different strain of flu, will that flu shot work on you? Whatever immune system activation it gave you, it will not. So that's what we're talking about. That's why flu shots, they say you need another flu shot for each flu season, because your immune system is very specific to the virus, the flu virus that was circulating around at that time. And the memory, that is also an important aspect of our immune system, will not be for that new guy. The immune system is systemic, the whole body, so it's not limited to the initial infection site. Do you notice how our innate system tried to keep everything localized? Well, the immune system doesn't care whether things are localized. If things are spreading, the immune system will spread on out to try and take care of things that are actually spreading around. So that's why it says systemic or whole body. Memory. Indeed, the immune system remembers prior infections of the same type. That's why we have vaccines. That's why we do immunizations, because we're giving you that early warning particle so that your immune system can then create an immune response and memory too, so that when that guy really does come into your system, it's just like, oh, we already know what you are. We have a whole group here to take care of you, and you're out of the system, and you may start to feel ill, but then the next day you're better and you think that echinacea worked wonders.
Is AIDS unrecognizable by ourselves? Is that why it was so hard to battle?
Well, HIV is an interesting virus because it actually attacks the cells of the immune system. So when you start to attack the cells of the immune system, you can't mount an immune response. And the other thing too is, and we'll get into the notes in a little bit, some detail on it, but the HIV virus unfortunately has some surface markers that look like some of our surface markers of our brain cells. So if you mount an immune response to HIV and those surface markers, you start offing your brain cells. So that's the AIDS dementia that sometimes you see is actually because of that. So the immune system is, it's fascinating, but it is why you are here. Because without your immune system, you would be like the boy in the bubble. And the boy in the bubble is there because he has no immune system. And survival in that bubble will only be accomplished if absolutely no pathogens are in that person's environment. Because the pathogens, your innate defenses will not help you for those things which are always trying to get inside you. They always want inside you because they know it's nice, warm, and it's like you're their own petri dish. You know, they can take off and have a great life and party. So let's take a look at the two branches of the immune system that are very important for overall health of the immune system. We have humoral immunity and cell-mediated immunity. So humoral immunity is antibody. Antibody mediated. These are proteins. These are plasma proteins, so we are protected. That are being produced by our B cells. Remember, B cells are B lymphocytes. And why do we call it humoral? Where do you find these proteins? In the plasma. That's right, in the bloodstream. And because they're in the bloodstream, or plasma more specifically, remember, plasma is always going into the interstitial spaces too. So anything that is plasma related is taking these plasma proteins with it. And that's why it's called humoral. Cell-mediated immunity, this is by cells interacting with other cells physically. I mean, they're coming into physical contact, and this is by our T cells. This little chart here shows a bit of the adaptive immunity, cell-mediated immunity, T lymphocytes. We have two types of T lymphocytes that are really important for us, cytotoxic T lymphocytes and helper T lymphocytes. We call them helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells. So those two branches of the T lymphocytes are exceedingly important. And if you'll notice in our little chart here, it says helper T cells produce a chemical that helps cytotoxic T cells. And also, helper T cells produce, again, that cytokine, a chemical that helps our humoral branch. Guess which cell HIV likes? HIV likes the T helper cell. And so the T helper cell is key to actually having effective cytotoxic T cells and effective B cells. We'll go into the responses of our T cells, but just to quickly take a look again at humoral immunity, B lymphocytes. The B lymphocyte will produce or transform themselves into what are called plasma cells, which are cells in the bloodstream, in the plasma, that are producing antibodies, which are then in the plasma. Antibodies sound a lot like antibiotics, yes? And they are designed to actually fight very specific types of pathogens. And so this requires a recognition process. So let's take a look at what they are recognizing. They are recognizing or being turned on by a substance called an antigen. So we're going to abbreviate that AG. AG is very different from AB. Which one is the good guy? Which one is the bad guy? AB's good, AG's bad. Okay, so that's one of the things that you have to realize. There's a lot of similarities here. Antigen, antibody. So you have to remember, antibodies like antibiotic, it's the good stuff. Antigen is the bad stuff or the foreign material in many cases. So we'll call antigens for right now large molecules, not normally present in the body. So large is really important too, large, because we're going to talk about haptens, which are small foreign materials. In order for an antigen to be considered a complete antigen, which will create the response that we desire, we state that it has immunogenicity. So in other words, it's recognizable. And we can react, which means we can turn on or activate the immune system cells. Some molecules of foreign material have some surface markers that look like our own cells, and that's one of the things with our HIV-infected cells, and some of our neurons look very similar. So immunogenicity recognized by the immune system as foreign, because some molecules on pathogens look like molecules on our own cells. So that's one way we would not be able to recognize them as being foreign, because, well, you look just like me. So I'm not recognizing you as being foreign. The other thing too is some antigens are too small to be recognizable. And we're going to talk about these guys. They're called haptens when they're too small to be recognized. Reactivity, turning on or activating the immune system cells. So all members of the immune system have to be properly activated. Hapten is related to our topic here on immunogenicity. We call that an incomplete antigen because it's actually considered small. It's less than 10,000 in its molecular weight. So that's still pretty big, but it's too small for our immune system to actually consider big enough to notice. So it's not big enough to notice. This usually cannot turn on immune system unless it attaches to a bigger molecule. Interestingly, these haptens can get stuck to albumin. Well, albumin is part of us, but then suddenly it's got this foreign material attached to it that it can now recognize it because it's big enough overall. The overall picture is big enough for recognition. And what happens now is it stimulates the immune system. We mount an immune response to this. And we're going to talk about this antibiotic, PCN. Does anybody know it? That antibiotic, what that abbreviation stands for? Penicillin. Very good. You guys are getting good with your abbreviations. Impressive. This is what it causes, for example, penicillin allergy. Why is anybody given penicillin? Is it to fight viral infections or bacterial infections or both? Penicillin is an antibiotic which is designed to fight bacterial infections. So when somebody comes in and they want penicillin and they have a bacterial infection and it's an appropriate antibiotic for the type of infection, you give them that antibiotic and they take it until they're well, correct?
No, they have to take it longer than beyond. You
Yeah.
always have to take it more than, you
Yes.
feel well after a short term, you have to take it longer.
That's right. So the comment is that it's recommended that you take penicillin longer than when you just feel well. And indeed, the prescriptions are typically written for 7 to 10 to 14 days, depending upon the type of infection, correct? A really big infection, you need longer time to treat. A smaller infection, but something that's important that still will respond to penicillin, a shorter course of therapy is effective. Well, what if you are given penicillin and you don't have a bacterial infection? You have a viral infection. So now you're given a foreign material that's floating around in your bloodstream, and it's actually too small to notice, but because it's floating around in your bloodstream, not doing anything, it can get stuck to albumin. And so suddenly, penicillin, which is floating around because there's nothing else for it to do, gets stuck to albumin, and now your immune system goes, hey, I didn't see you before, but now you're big enough to see. And now I can actually mount an immune response, and suddenly you have penicillin allergies. You have reactions to penicillin. So that is one of the reasons why many times doctors don't like to, and healthcare providers don't like to give antibiotics for what they really view as a viral infection. Now, influenza is a viral infection, isn't it? And it sure can make you feel crappy, right? And it can give you a bacterial infection by accident, correct? Because influenza can knock down your immune system to where other creepy crawlies can come in and invade you. But how often does that really happen? It's not very often. But, you know, one life, you know, people think, well, one life, it's worth it to give it to everybody. Well, no, it's not, because if you give antibiotics to everybody that gets the flu, then you will get more antibiotic allergies as well as resistance to antimicrobials. And so that's why there's always that fine line. And so when people have influenza, it's always nice to have somebody checking on them to make sure that they're suddenly not, you know, they feel like crap. They feel like crap for about 3 to 4 days. And they have a high fever for that time period. But then they should start to be able to actually plateau and start to slowly get better. It takes them 10 to 14 days. And that's why most vaccines take 2 weeks to actually work for you, because that's the normal time frame that it takes for your immune system's first time exposure to respond effectively to get rid of it. But if you're starting to, you know, plateau and then you suddenly get worse again, that's not the flu. You guys realize that. That's something else going on, and that requires, you know, follow-up doctors or ER or urgent care type of visit. But there's some people that the virus can overwhelm their immune system so much that their immune system cannot fight that. And that's why that person isn't here anymore. But that's why I say the reason you are here right now is because of your immune system. Your immune system is strong enough and recognizes those pathogens which invade you that it actually takes care of it. And so that's why your presence on this earth is still here. And this is because of your parents and your parents' parents and your parents' parents, because the immune system is an inherited phenomenon. Just like the baby in the bubble, he did not inherit an immune system. And so therefore, he has to hope for genes from somebody else's bone marrow to actually create an immune system for him. But your immune system is the reason why you're here. and your parents were exposed to all of the different things that you have been exposed to, and their parents before them, so that they were able to pass on the genes to recognize the pathogens that are actually in our environment. So it's a really interesting process. And that brings me to that thing here called antigenic determinants. The precise location on the antigen, remember our antigen is considered a foreign material for the most part. Okay? The precise location on the antigen where antibodies physically attach. And so what we're talking about here is that spots on the pathogen are specific for that pathogen and are what we create AB antibodies to. There are often many different antigenic determinants per antigen/pathogen. So if you have a an E. coli, let's make a rod type guy here. He's got all kinds of things all over his surface that make him E. coli. And you will have antibodies that are only going to respond, only going to be created and recognized that specific one. So let's do a blue one here. Oop. That's all. The Ys are the antibodies, and we'll discuss why the Ys are antibodies next time. So we'll stop there. We'll talk a little bit about some very specific antigen types or antigenic determinants next time.